I'm going to say a few words of greetings to hello everybody to IRD's first ever Friday evening event in 40 years. A true test of loyalty and interest to what we have to say, organized by our Just War Scholar in Residence, Mark Levecki, but on a very important and somber topic, so we're delighted to have our guest speakers this evening. This is being live broadcast on the Providence Facebook page, and the video will be recorded later, so everyone behave and speak accordingly. But we're just really glad you're here, and I will turn the lectern over to Mark Levecki.
All right, thanks, boss. Yeah, so I guess I start with an apology. I have no idea. I mean, if nothing else, I thought this would be a pre-game event. So I don't understand Friday nights in DC, obviously. I'm not a DC native. But thank you for coming, and thank you for helping us observe what is, I think, a grim anniversary, but one that was certainly pivotal maybe in me figuring out as a sort of a wandering 20-something-year-old in Eastern Europe what I wanted to do with my life, and this helped shape that. So here I am doing military ethics. We'll get into more of that later, but first I wanted to introduce our two speakers. This is Lieutenant Colonel Joe Chapa, a good friend of mine who I've known for several years now. He is a pilot in the United States Air Force and is presently working at the Pentagon. We'll see more about all of that as we go. And Victoria, or Tori Clarke, who during 9/11 was in the Pentagon on that day as Undersecretary of Defense for Public Affairs.
Just got a promotion. Assistant Secretary of Defense.
Assistant Secretary of Defense under Donald Rumsfeld, of course. And she now runs a podcast called Chatter On.
Chatter On Books.
Chatter On Books.
It's great. It's wonderful.
Yeah, you should check it out.
Yeah.
A lot of good authors, lots of good books. Back to school,
That's
consultant, advisor, and the president, I think, of the Donald Rumsfeld, or the Rumsfeld
Yeah,
Foundation.
the board.
The board.
Rumsfeld Foundation.
Okay, and that's where we met. I was a Rumsfeld Fellow. He supported some of the graduate work that I did under Gene Elstein back in the day, and it's a great and growing.
What year were you?
I was, I should know that off the top of my head, 2009, maybe, something like that.
Great group.
He called me a former fellow, which is makes me
Okay.
feel like Caitlyn Jenner, so I'm not quite sure what to do. Which that might be too soon, but sorry. So thank you guys for both for being here. My ambition is pretty modest. I want, simply to reflect on the day. And so I'll ask both of them to describe your own experiences of the day, and then to move from that into reflections on what has changed in America after 2 decades. What has changed within the U.S. military. What are the lessons learned? I think it's impossible not to feel like we should bookend 9/11 with the events that have recently transpired with our pullout in Afghanistan. So to some degree we can touch on that. But I would like to conclude with the observation that none of this, I think, is in the rearview mirror. And if nothing else, all three of us, I think, have worked in varying degrees on post-traumatic stress disorders or moral injury with our combat veterans. And so I'd like to maybe conclude with some reflections simply on that. That the foreign policy and the operations aside, 9/11 and the subsequent 2 decades are going to linger for a very long time. In our homes, in our barracks, and elsewhere, and I think that pays to be remembered. So to start us off, Tori, you were in the building on that day. Could you walk us through that? Take us back. Okay.
Sure, and I tend to talk too much, so somebody just likes to me. I get asked this a lot, obviously, and I always say, okay, you gotta back up a little bit. And prior to going to work at the Pentagon, very early part of 2001, I had run in some agency down the Watergate building, and I was fat and happy, and I was the head of the Friends Don't Let Friends Go Back in the Government Committee, and I worked 9 to 5, baby. And long story short, somebody called me up, and when Bush 43-1 and said, oh, you really good talk to people at the Pentagon about this job, ASD Foreign Affairs. I said, no, they've never done that, not, whatever. And I had done a big study for the Pentagon the year before on recruiting for the military. Anyways, they said, okay, just go over and talk to them, so I'm trying to figure this out. never met Don Russell in my life. And I said, okay, happy to. And they said, okay, Saturday at 2 o'clock. And this is what a pig I am. I think Saturday. It's the only day he's got. What do you mean Saturday? But what attracted me and what convinced me to take the job then was it wasn't about the Balkans. It wasn't about terrorist attacks. It was about transforming the 20th century military to the 21st century military. Transformation is one of my favorite words. I think it's a never-ending process. There's not a beginning, there's not an end. You're just constantly transforming to adapt to the challenges in front of you. And the more I talked to this strange person I'd never met before, the more I thought this could be really something. So I signed up, and for essentially January until September 10th, everything we were doing was focused on transforming the military and telling everybody we could find, members of Congress, the media, people around the world. The world's changed, there are these different asymmetrical threats that we've not focused on before, and we need to adapt and change. And the visual I always have, setting visually, is members of Congress patting us on the head going, that's nice. And now we'd like to spend $100 billion on 16 new aircraft carriers, thank you very much. And be very, very patronizing. The morning of 9/11, and how many of you lived in this area that day 20 years ago? Do you remember what the weather was like? Just like freaky. Tomorrow's supposed to be like this too. So this time of year in Washington can be miserable, hot, muggy, being inside a giant ping pong ball. And it was one of the most stunningly beautiful days. And pilots, significant, called it severe clear. The conditions were just spectacular for flying. So we all headed to the office of the building at dark 30, whatever, and Rumsfeld had a meeting with some members of Congress that morning in the building. And it was, I think it was over breakfast, and they were talking about different things, and they were talking to him about the Social Security lockbox. I don't even remember what that is. And he said, look, here you have been a member of Congress, and goes, but we have really got to start shaking things up here and changing things, because some bad stuff is going to happen, and you do not want to be on the wrong side of that. And they looked at him and said, what are you talking about? And he, went through the litany again, and they head off back up to Capitol Hill, and that's when the first plane hit the first building in New York. And like a lot of people, especially in Washington, you always have multiple TVs on. In my office in the Pentagon, 5 or 6 televisions, and that morning I had a big long conference table full of people, military, civilian, and we were getting ready for a regularly scheduled press briefing later that morning. And can anybody guess what the 2 big issues were that we were wrestling with the morning of 9/11 before the first plane hit? National security issues. Okay? One was missile defense. Remember that? Really scary missile defense. And there were scheduled protests at the IMF because we were going to have a test of missile defense on October 31. And I was sitting there going, okay guys, I'm not the military expert in the room, but Halloween is probably not a good time to do this test. Can we change that? So we're talking about that. How are we going to rest of the briefing? And then the second thing was, there was great controversy and criticism because there was a weapons collection program going on in the Balkans. And it was called Operation Amber Fox. And I said, okay guys, again, it was all guys. I said, I am not the military expert in the room, but I said, maybe if it's not Balkans, maybe if we call it Operation Weapons Collection, people would actually turn in their weapons, because nobody's turning in anything. And while they're yelling at me because I don't understand these things, I'm doing a whole search. Amber Fox was a porn star. And that's why that particular operation involved. But I tell you this because those were things that we consider big issues. Those are things that immediate people were considering big issues. And it also demonstrates that we had failed in convincing people or communicating to people that we really needed to transform the military. So the first plane hits the first building. Smart people like pilots immediately, and most of us thought, oh, it was a weather plane or a commuter plane or something like that. And most pilots that I know said, not an accident, because the conditions were too perfect. More likely, maybe somebody committed suicide. I'm on the phone talking to Rumsfeld's chief of staff, Larry DeRita, and we're both talking, I said, if you told him, he goes, yeah, he's aware of it, when the second plane came. And that's immediately when everybody knew the terrorist attack. You knew right away it was commercial airliners, and the smart people, I was not one of them, immediately started to suggest quietly, privately, that Al-Qaeda was probably the organization that had the resources, the training, etc., to be able to pull something like that off. So that, everything that you want spinning up, all the crisis management systems that you want spinning up start to spin up. and this is one of my favorite stories about Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld at the time was in his office getting his daily briefing from his CIA briefer, a spectacular woman named Denny Watson. If you've never met this woman, you should try to meet her. And Rumsfeld said to us, because you guys get to the command center, and I'll be there in a little bit, but I want to finish my briefing with Denny. So we head off. They're in his office, and we're in a small room, no windows, no nothing, in the middle of the Pentagon on the 3rd floor, pretty center of the building, when you just feel this enormous thump, and you literally felt the building move, and a huge noise, but it's very muffled. And I was the first person, there were about 10 of us, I was the first person who said anything. I said, oh my God, I spent a car alarm. Which you'd think, if I had any brains, I would have said, wow, that was a plane. But it was not our frame of reference at the time. So my God, I must have been a car alarm. And somebody else said something else, and I swear to God, one of the smartest guys in the room looked at the ceiling, and he said, oh no, it's the heating and cooling unit. That system makes that banging noise all the time. So for the 3rd time in 45 minutes, essentially, I said, I'm not the military expert. I do not think that was the heating and cooling system. So that, and our primary focus for the first few hours was prevent further attacks, get as many planes on the ground as you possibly could get on the ground. The overwhelming majority of the people in the building, about 22,000, I don't know what it is now, were evacuated. 2 of my deputies who were spectacular got the Pentagon Press Corps a quarter of a mile away, took over a gas station to set up a briefing center there, and so they could operate from there. And the day unfolded. And the story about Rumsfeld is, we're in the middle of this, we hear it, we feel it, but we're not sure, and everybody's calling everybody, and you're watching television, and we're not sure, but when Rumsfeld was in his office, and it happened, he turns to a couple people and said, what was it? And nobody knew. He couldn't get any answers. He said, well, I'm gonna go find it. And that's when he headed out of the building. Just very common sense, very practical, very, well, nobody knows, I'll go find out. And he knows that building, he knew that building like the back of his hand. So he just goes jogging down a increasingly smoke-filled hallway and goes outside, and was one of the first people at the crash site. And with some others, helped pull people out of the wreckage, helped get some people taken over to ambulances, and then once the EMTs started to show up in some numbers, then he came back into the building, and he was the first one, he was our eyewitness. He said, he goes, no, it was a plane, because of all the pieces and what could seem left over. That was the start of the day.
And in the office of the Rumsfeld Foundation is a piece of that plan.
Yes.
The key.
I can tell 9 million stories, you gotta stop me. So later in the day, we go through the day and all sorts of things going on, and he and Dick Myers are working like this, and he wanted to go back out and tour the site. It was about 3:34 in the afternoon, and by this time the FBI had taken over the site. It was a crime scene, and they are in charge of it. We were no longer in charge of the Pentagon reservation. They were in charge of it, and we're walking along, and a handful of us, the secretary, and there's a pretty big piece of the airplane there, and he picks it up, and I said, again, I'm the expert in pick, I said, I don't think you're supposed to be touching any of this. And he goes, of course I can't. He starts, and this FBI woman, this tall, built like a fire plug, tackles him. You can't do that! Like, grabs it from him, and we did eventually get it back somehow. We got it back somehow, but, yeah. But the remarkable thing, and we all talk about where were you and what did you know, the more time goes by, that actual day, people did remarkable things. People did remarkably brave, incredible things. Right before I came down, I was listening to a story. There's a daycare center at the Pentagon, about 100 babies, toddlers, and the people in the daycare center just immediately said, we gotta get them out of here, and volunteers just started showing up out of anywhere and saying, we'll help you, and they got them a quarter of a mile away to a safe spot within minutes, absolute minutes. There's so many countless stories like that I'm just always in awe of. And we were talking a little bit earlier, if you've not been to the Flight 93 memorial site in Pennsylvania, go. It's a beautiful spot, and the remarkable thing about people on Flight 93, unlike, God rest their souls, the people from the World Trade Towers or the people in the plane at the Pentagon, people on Flight 93 knew what was going on. They knew what had happened in Washington. They knew that terrorists wanted to fly their plane into a building, and they made a conscious decision in a matter of minutes that they were going to die to save other people. And people would get up in the morning and hop on a flight, a 2-hour flight, thinking, this is what I'm going to do today. The their bravery was incredible. And because it was later in the morning, there were so many recordings, their phone conversations to their loved ones, to law enforcement, back to the airports, things like that, and it's really pretty remarkable. So if you're ever driving that direction, it's worth stopping by.
And just to interject, one of the remarkable things I think about those recorded phone calls is just the steady bearing of the voices. I mean,
Yeah.
To me, it's unbelievable. I thought it was a really bad actor reinterpretation, and then only
Totally
realized
calm.
movies are authentic.
Yeah.
Baby, I hope I make it home today.
Yeah.
If I
If I don't, yeah.
Now, you were a 16-year-old boy.
It was 17.
17, sorry.
Young man, 17-year-old
Young
man. My experience was very, very different. I was a senior in high school. So by the time, because we were kids, there was no smartphones back then, right? And so we got little snippets at the end of first period that something had happened. And then second period, I was in my AP physics class. I won't share the name of the teacher because I haven't gotten his permission to tell the story, but he found one of those TVs that you roll out on the cart, and so we just stood there and watched the news. So the first plane had already hit, and then by this time we were able to see the second plane hit on the news. And I grew up outside of Boston, and so our weather pattern was the same weather pattern as New York. So it was the same beautiful, it was a little cooler up there, but just beautiful fall day. And so we got to watch this thing happen. And so my physics teacher, I had a physics teacher who was fired for indiscretions. And so we had this new physics teacher that we didn't know very well. I didn't know anything about him. His name was Joe. I think that's an excellent name. But otherwise, I didn't know a thing. And he said, hey, let's all hold hands and pray. And, at this public school in Massachusetts. So we held hands and we prayed. And so then the rest of the day was just devoted to this, right? And I will admit to you that, going between classes is just, right? Once you leave the room where the TV is, you have no means of getting truthful information. So I remember in the hallway, someone told me that the Sears Tower had been hit by an airplane. And I will admit to you that I spread that rumor, right? Because we didn't know any better. And at the time, it just felt like, oh, so the tall buildings are under attack, right? Like we just didn't have any sense for the scope. And so we went throughout the rest of that day. I remember some days later, I took, during one of the breaks, I went to this teacher's class and I said, hey, I didn't even know that you believed in God. And he goes, well, I don't. But that felt like the right thing to do at the time. And I think that kind of captures the zeitgeist at the moment, right? Which was this, it was really, looking back, plenty of scholars have written about how it wasn't an existential threat. In the moment, it felt existential, right? It felt like this is an attack on the United States that we don't understand, that we can't stop. It's continuing to happen throughout the morning. And I felt, as a 17-year-old kid, I felt like the United States was powerless. And that's a weird thing for a kid who grew up. I mean, the first news story I remember seeing was from the Gulf War in 1991. Right? So my dad served 20 years in the Air Force. My older sister had already joined ROTC. So my perception of what the U.S. military was capable of was probably imprecise, but it was informed by these previous decades. And it just felt like all of that was shattered. And so I won't tell you that I'm one of these people who went to the recruiter's office the next day. I had already planned to join the U.S. Air Force and do ROTC and all of those things. But the way that event changed the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. military and the U.S. in a lot of ways did have profound implications down the line. And as I look back, I can see that my career has been just 100% different from what it would have been or what I thought it was going to be when I was 17 on September 10th.
So September 10th, you're thinking I'm going to join the U.S. Air Force. September 12th, you're still thinking that, but now you know you're going to join a wartime Air Force. Where you speculate this isn't going to end anytime soon, right? Does that recalibrate you in any way? Does that maybe not change your mind, but reshape your sense of vocation, of calling?
I think so. I mean, again, I was 17, so I don't think that my understanding of the virtues as a 17-year-old were not very mature. But I did have a sense that what would be asked of me in an all-volunteer force as a person who joined during wartime would be different than what it was, for example, for my dad, who was in the Air Force for 20 years, never deployed, right? Never contributed in combat operations. His service was excellent and laudable, but it was service during peacetime, and that was just going to be different for my generation and those that have come after that. So there was this kind of recognition that I would be at. So I did when I was a kid. I had friends whose dads left for a year because they went to Korea or wherever. We have military presences around the world even during peacetime. And so I saw what happened in those families. That was a challenge for those families. And so I did recognize that my military service would probably be characterized by time away from home and possibly by risk, right? I mean, at that point, we didn't know what the sport was going to look like, but we knew there was going to be a fight, and I was volunteering to participate in that. And I had wanted to be a fighter pilot since I was 5, so my conception of what my service would be was at the pointy end as far as the Air Force goes, right? It was in combat operations. That's where I anticipated.
So, nice segue. You're going to enter a fight that you don't know what it's going to look like. You're all about transforming the military. And I think you told a story once, maybe at one of the Rumsfeld events, where you had a photo of the horsemen in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And so you've got that transformed high-tech light force riding rather ancient military vehicles.
Riding ancient military vehicles using GPS devices to I don't know what the expression, I've lost track of so much of the vernacular that I picked up, but to guide the Vietnam era bombers where they needed to be. But okay, too many stories. So December of 2001, we go over to Afghanistan, the middle of the night, we're in Bagram Air Base, there are no lights, no nothing, it's just insane. And Rumsfeld had a notorious streak for wanting a light security detail, which is non-existent. And I used to say to them, this works for you, because the bad guys will try to kill you, and they'll, the one security guy will save you, the rest of us are going to die. But anyhow, we were landing on this airfield in the middle of nowhere, and the Northern Alliance fighters with AK-47s are lining the tarmac on either sides of where we're landing, kind of in a gesture of respect, I guess. Every kind of attire you can imagine, and AK-47s and lots of other weapons, and Rumsfeld kind of looks out the window at them and looks at his security guy, looks back and goes, wow, I hope they're on our side. But one of these we did on that trip is we met some of our guys, who had teamed up with the Northern Alliance fighters and had gotten on horses. And we've seen video of this as well. And I ride horses, so I know how hard this is. Incredible terrain, horribly mountainous, terrible terrain. And what they galloped up and down on these horses. And we're talking to these guys, there were maybe 10 of them. And in the middle of this cabin with no lights and anything else. And they're telling these stories, and we're looking at these pictures, and I said, okay, hands up, how many of you had ridden horses before you did this? One hand went up. And Rumsfeld, whenever he met with people in uniform, which he loved to do, big groups, small groups, 2 people, whatever, he'd always say, what do you need? And he asked these guys, what do you need? And they said, oh my God, we need real saddles. Because the Afghans used essentially 2 pieces, the horse's back is like this, 2 pieces of wood with a couple ropes going over the back. Very painful. So we need saddles, and the horses are really hungry, so we need feed. Rumsfeld's favorite order that he ever signed was saddles and horse meat to be dropped into Afghanistan.
I'm reading, I mentioned this over drinks, that I'm reading Charlie Wilson's War. And if you've never seen the movie, see the movie. If you've never read the book, read the book. Nothing has changed in Afghanistan. I mean, these guys are filling out orders for Tennessee mules to have shipped over to run weapons from Pakistan.
But I should have really answered your question. I apologize. What was people would look at that and go, oh my God, ancient, they're on horses, you kidding me? That was transformational. They used what they needed at the time. The only things that could get in that terrain were horses, so they had to use that, and they wanted to call in the bombers with pinpoint precision, and they used state-of-the-art GPS devices. That was transformational.
And part of your job, if I'm correct on this, is to communicate all of this to the American people. I mean, I remember before I ever met you and before I ever met the secretary, I remember you guys doing these nightly, I don't know if they're nightly, but regular news broadcasts in Slovakia. You guys are explaining the war to the American people and international people. And really, in some ways, became maybe not the face of the conflict, but helped me understand what was going on. How did you communicate this event to the American people? What were the challenges? What was the hardest part of your role there? What did you say about that?
Plenty of people can agree or disagree with Rumsfeld and others on decisions they made and things like that. But doing what I do, communications, and I have a very forward-leaning approach to communications. I will be as transparent as possible, especially if you're in the public sector, give as much information as possible, good, bad, in between. American people can figure things out. So I was a big believer of that before. And then all of a sudden, it was a whole new world. And people really didn't know how dramatically things have changed. I said, we just have to get as much information out as possible, being careful not to reveal information that shouldn't be revealed. And I was so blessed that I had someone like Rumsfeld who no two ways about it. He says, I'm a 1960s, 1970s guy. He says, I don't really know how to do this, but he was enlightened enough to know, just as we were trying to transform everything else about the military, we had to transform how we communicated. So it was very forward-leaning, it was very transparent. It was engaged with big groups, small groups, on the record, off the record, everything we could do. But the day of 9/11, the building was heavily damaged, obviously. And although the crash site was somewhat contained, the smoke and the fumes filling the building were pretty intense. And for that reason, and because they considered it was a likely another target, a lot of people wanted to get Rumsfeld out of the building. And he wouldn't leave. And he said two things. He says the communications are working, and they were, and that was pretty important. He says, secondly, we don't want to let the bad guys or anybody else think that they succeeded here. The building continued to operate. It never stopped. The Department of Defense establishment never stopped working. And so, against a lot of protests, we stayed in the building, a handful of stayed in the building, and late in the day, it was probably 6:37, John Warner and Carl Levin came down from the hill. It was the first big briefing. I had gone out and briefed the media a couple times at the gas station, but it was the first big briefing of them. And again, everybody said, we can't get the media back from the gas station a quarter mile away, we can't bring them to the building, it's a crime scene, all these things, we got to take Rumsfeld there. And I said, you have to do it from the building. And he backed me up, which was great. So, long-winded way of saying we are all about as much information as possible in as timely a fashion as possible. Pretty simple.
Joe, you and I have talked a lot about your vocation within the U.S. Air Force. Recently, we talked about the paradigm shift that 9/11 helped signal. You phrased it, I think, and you can clarify. We moved from targeting machines and breaking things, right, breaking the enemy's stuff, to targeting people. And again, to reference the Charlie Wilson's war, back then, like the CIA was all about not appearing in any way as if we're doing targeted killings, assassinations, these sorts of things, all the way to the point of refusing to ship. They shipped them anyway. Long-range scopes for rifles, because that might give the appearance that we're actually doing targeting. That shifted. We switched from targeting machines to targeting men. Can you elaborate on that? Say something about that. How did that change? What might have been your role in the U.S. Air Force to what it actually did?
Yeah, so the way that it affected my role, I mentioned I want to be a fighter pilot. I went to pilot training, so now I have to wait a year to go to pilot training because their training's backed up. And then pilot training takes over a year. And then I was assigned to the A-10 Warthog, but they said, well, but the schoolhouse is backed up, so you're going to wait 18 more months. And so it got to the point where, like, I'm a post-9/11 volunteer. So by this point, it has been several years that my nation has been at war, and I feel like I have not contributed anything to that because I've been in training the whole time. And so when they told me it was going to be 18 months for the A-10, I started asking the Air Force Personnel Center, what else can I do? Can I put me in an instructor job so I can train new pilots today? And they said, nope, sorry, I can't do it. I'll follow. I said, all right, then put me in one of these. We were buying commercial off-the-shelf airplanes and then retrofitting them for Air Force Special Operations Command. So twin-engine props or single-engine props. I said, all right, put me in one of those. And they said, sorry, that schoolhouse is backed up too. And so I kept trying to move faster. I wanted to get there faster and produce effects for our commanders faster. And so I said, all right, well, I heard about this Predator thing. What about that? And they're like, oh yeah, you have a Predator right now. Because the Predator, as I'm sure you know, is a remotely piloted aircraft. So the crews stay in the United States. They fly the missions while the airplane's over Afghanistan or elsewhere. And we were non-voluntarily pulling pilots out of other cockpits because training was backed up, et cetera, and putting them in the Predator. And there were some traditionally trained pilots who were very upset about that. And so when I said, hey, I will volunteer to go fill one of those seats, the personnel establishment was very happy to hear that. And so that was like November, and I was at Creech Air Force Base in January, which is pretty fast for the personnel center to turn orders around like that. So now I find myself in this Predator environment, which I volunteered for. It was at a time that community was rapidly growing, and I want to say a little bit about the background and how we got there. So in the 1990s, you'll recall, right? We were a cutting-edge force. We were using laser-guided weapons in 1991, right? We demonstrated that our technologically sophisticated Air Force could just decimate the Iraqi military, which had the fourth largest army in the world, fifth largest army in the world at the time. Right, so we were demonstrating this proof of concept of what some people have called the second offset, right? We're going to use technology to offset the numbers that the adversary has, and we were incredibly effective at that. But what that meant for people in the United States Air Force specifically is we got really good at destroying other machines. We used our machines really effectively to destroy their machines. And when you start to look at the history of the Air Force, that's been true. That's been the ethos for a long time. So there are. I'm sure you know about the ACEs, right? The ACEs of World War II or the Vietnam War. If you get 5 adversary kills, then you become an ace. You know how that's defined? It's not defined by killing enemy pilots. If you shoot down an enemy airplane and that pilot ejects, and tomorrow he takes a different airplane, you still get credit because you destroyed the machine. So an ace is not someone who's defeated 5 pilots, it's someone who's destroyed 5 airplanes. And that was our ethos, right? So even now, if you go to the Air and Space Museum, you will see airplanes in that museum that have, for example, a red star painted on the side of the airplane. What's that designating? That's not designating that this pilot destroyed that pilot. That's the score for this airplane. This F-4 Phantom, this machine, achieved 2 kills against 2 other machines, right? So we have this psychology over decades that says what we're about as the United States Air Force is we're about using technology to destroy technology. And that's why we want our technology to be better. And that's been a kind of cornerstone of the Air Force thinking for a long time. The joke is on an Army base, you will see statues of men. The statues tend to be men. If you drive on an Air Force base, you'll see airplanes on sticks, right? Because, as they say, the Air Force worships at the altar of technology. So this has been the ethos for 50 years. And then 9/11 happens. Now, in the background, there was targeted killing in the 1990s. It just tended to be by means of cruise missiles rather than Hellfire missiles. And that didn't always go so well. So in 1998, the United States knew that Osama bin Laden was a threat. President Clinton authorized cruise missile strikes against 2 positions, one in Sudan and one in coast Afghanistan. The assumption was that the Sudan site was a training camp, and they thought bin Laden would actually be at the coast site. Due to reporting after the fact, we now know that bin Laden made a last-minute decision to go to Kandahar. That might have been because he was being tipped off by others, who knows. But neither of those missile strikes were successful. And so people within the Air Force and within the CIA started to say, hey, what if we have this predator, and we see this tall-robed gentleman who everyone else seems to be deferring to and respecting. If this is Osama bin Laden, maybe we could attack him with one of these predators. What if we put a missile on the predator? And that was in 2000. So this arming of the predator really was designed to target Osama bin Laden before September 11th. And so then September 11th happens, and everyone in the U.S. government is saying, all right, we need to do this now. So they interrupted the testing phase of the Hellfire missiles on the Predator and sort of rushed to production. And so what ends up happening is this history of the Predator, which goes back a long way, and the history of Al-Qaeda and the 9/11 attacks kind of just get intertwined right there on 9/11 in a way that just would not have happened otherwise. And so now we take this fledgling community of Predator pilots, which was kind of the stepchild. I think everyone can agree on that. And they started to be given really important missions, right? So the list of people that the President or the Secretary of Defense or other combatant commanders wanted to target, leaders of the Taliban, leaders of Al-Qaeda, they started handing those targets to the Predator units. And so that changed dramatically the way the Air Force had to approach what it is that we do. Because I'm no longer trying to destroy a $30 million airplane. It's that guy under the crosshairs, right? Success or failure will be defined by whether that person lives or dies. And I know we'll talk more about moral injury later on, but I think that switch caught us by surprise. I don't think we were sort of psychologically and emotionally prepared for the work that we were going to be asked to do. And it wasn't just us, right? The gunships are doing the same thing, and the F-16 crews are doing the same thing. It's just that we tended to make the news because it was new and it was different. So yeah, it was a dramatic paradigm shift in my opinion.
If you're willing to talk about this, part of that difference is this bizarre amalgam of you being geographically distant from the kill, but having an exquisite level of intimacy about what it is you're doing because of the optics. Right? Can you say, we talked before about how long you might stay lawyering to how long you stay after a shot is taken. Can you kind of walk us through some of that and the types of things that an RPA pilot might see? And I don't ask this to be like macabre, but I think it plays into this question of moral injury and the spiritual costs or the psychological costs of combat, right? Where all of a sudden you're maybe the most distant from the war zone, but you have the most intimate kind of killing. But even people, with the exception of maybe people who are hand-to-hand combat, they don't see. Could you walk us through some of that?
Yes, I mean, so one of the kind of mythologies out there is that all the Predator and Reaper crews do is this targeted killing or high-value targeting operations. But there's a wide spectrum of things, right? So a crew or an entire squadron might be focused on close air support, where you're doing something very, very similar to what F-16 pilots are doing, or 10 pilots are doing. But there is this high-value targeting kind of operation. And so there, what tends to happen is A squadron will be tasked to follow an individual person for a long time. Sometimes it's patterns of life, meaning I want to know what time people leave the house and what time they come back. Sometimes it's trying to build the network so that the intelligence organizations, many of them, are using this data from the predator and reaper feeds to try to build out the network. It says, okay, every Tuesday at noon, this guy goes to that house. This other guy also goes to that house every Tuesday at noon, right? So you start to put together this picture that says, hey, maybe there's something going on at that house Tuesdays at noon that we need to find out more about. But what it means is that for every Hellfire shot, there could be countless hours of watching that precedes that, right? To build the picture of what's going on the ground. And so what that meant for us was that sometimes, it just depends on the situation, but sometimes you could spend a lot of time watching a person go about their sort of daily lives. You could see them interact with their kids. You could see them interact with their spouse.
You saw them as people.
Yeah, it's very humanizing, right? I mean, I have one friend who tells a story that he saw a guy irrigating his field, right? And we were living in Missouri in the summertime. So we know a little bit about that, right? And he said that moment in particular was so humanizing for him that this person who might turn out to be a target, and eventually did turn out to be a target, is just out there watering his lawn, right? And so that doesn't, from a just war theory ethical perspective, that doesn't mean that targeting this person is wrong. Targeting this person is still morally the right thing to do, assuming that all the just war conditions have been met. It just means that the toll that that's going to take on the person who squeezes the trigger, the sensor operator who's going to guide the weapon in, right? Potentially the intel analysts that are supporting all this, they're going to carry this kind of emotional, moral, spiritual burden with them because it was so humanizing. I don't think that's something we should try to avoid. I would much rather just try to prepare crews for that better than we did back in the day. And we've had 20 years, right? So we've come a long way, and the resources that are available to crews are really incredible compared to what was there when the war first came out.
I used to, one of the many people from my work, I worked for John Mccain, who was, he went to his grave loving it. People called him a fighter pilot. He was a bomber pilot. And people always referred to him as an ace. Yeah, he always referred to him as an ace. And at some event once, and one of his fellow POWs, guy named Orson Swindle, great guy, was standing there, and McCain yacked away. And I said to Orson, ace, what does that mean? I had no clue. And he goes, destroyed 5 aircraft. And I said, oh. And I'm trying to go, and he goes, yeah. He goes, the problem is John dropped one off the Arispe, naked, literally, just dropped it off the side, flew one into some power lines in Spain that took out the entire power grid in all of Spain. He was sitting in his plane on the forestall when some munitions were on the deck, for whatever reason, took off, and one flew into the side of his plane, started to fire on the forestall. I can't remember the other one, and then he got shot down. And he was the first one to say it didn't take any talent, to get shot down. But he used to talk about, people would talk, they'd meet him, and they'd say, oh my God, you're so brave, so brave. And he goes, look, because you're up in a plane and you're dropping bombs, you don't see people. You do not, he had the greatest respect for people on the ground, seeing people face to face, eye to eye, and I think he would say the same thing about this. It wasn't that it was the wrong thing to do, but people weren't prepared for seeing these targets as human beings. He's always very respectful of that.
So I want to move toward opening it up for audience discussion and questions, but just a few last questions. As I said, it's hard not to bookend. We've got 20 years. What's changed over 20 years in the war on terror? What has changed for you? What's different about maybe the business? What's different about America? What have you learned about America and Americans that you didn't know 20 years ago, that you know now?
Do we have 3 hours?
We have views we can kick back.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a little reluctant to talk about current events in any kind of political way. And I should say that everything I have said to you this evening, these are my views and don't necessarily reflect the government. It's true that I'm required to tell you that, but also I would like to just emphasize that I think there's something pretty powerful in that the government empowers me to go out and have my own ideas and then to share them with you with my rank and title in front of my name. Not every country's military lets people do that. So I'm happy to have a frank discussion. I'm going to stay well outside of domestic politics. But I think the close of events in Afghanistan and the 20-year retrospective does give us the opportunity to look back and ask ourselves some really hard questions about trade-offs and about what in just war theory we call proportionality, which is really a question about whether it was worth it, I watched the memorial ceremony at the Pentagon today, and General Hyten emphasized the fact that our mission was to prevent another 9/11 style attack, and we did that. And that's true. We did do that. It came at a tremendous cost. It came at a cost to service members' lives. It came at lots of financial cost on the part of the United States taxpayer. But it also came at a tremendous cost to Afghan civilians. And I don't think we're ever going to know exactly what those numbers are. There's plenty of reporting out there that you can take a look at. And I'm not going to be dogmatic about the answer, right? I do think though that we as American citizens, not me as a service member, but we as American citizens, kind of have an obligation to ask ourselves hard questions about whether war is worth it. And I don't think we were in a position to do that on September 12th, 2001. That was a defensive crouch, and I don't think we had any choice but to get into that defensive crouch. But we have had the time and space now that we can look back and ask some of those questions. And I hope that informs the way that we approach conflicts in the future. I will tell you, as a 17-year-old who was pretty gung-ho about being a pilot in the Air Force, I was enthusiastic about going to war over 9/11. In hindsight, I regret that. I don't think war is something to be enthusiastic about in that sense. But all this to say, I think each of us should probably set aside some time and work through some of those questions and start to think about when we think war is worth it, and under what conditions, and what are we willing to pay, not just in financial treasure, but especially in the lives of U.S. service members, but also the civilians in the war zone.
Okay, settle in, get another drink. I'm pretty obsessed with words, and even 20 years ago, and pre-9/11, and certainly afterwards, Afghanistan, Iraq, we have to do a better job of helping people understand how dramatically things have changed, and we have to quit using the same vocabulary. And I fought tooth and nail with speechwriters and others, because the word war, beginning, end, countries with borders, these are the connotations, right? This is the frame of reference. Countries with borders, the signing ceremony on the Missouri. That wasn't true 20 years ago. It's so not true now. Afghanistan, if you know anything about Afghanistan, you know this much. It doesn't have a national identity. It never has. It's a bunch of warlords, right? The only reason Karzai got to be president, he was the only warlord who didn't have an army. It's like, oh, okay, he's the safe one, right? The notion or the optimism that there could ever be, and I'm sure I failed sometimes, but I tried so hard not to use the word democracy. Because when you say democracy in other parts of the world, they think Jeffersonian, no, some kind of representative form of government. I didn't have many hopes for that. But I think we need to change the complete frame of reference of how we think about what is a good use of U.S. military in the 21st century. My head has been exploding for the last few days, and I called and left an obscene voicemail for somebody at CNN today, because Jake Tapper's got this big special when, Afghanistan, 20 years, what went wrong? A lot of, effing stuff went right. If you think about it, 93 was the first attack of the World Trade Towers. It took them 8 years to take them down. And we thought that was extraordinary. We thought this took so long. Oh my God. Knock on wood 1,000,000 times. For 20 years, that place was not a safe haven from which terrorists can train, equip, prepare, launch attacks, and start. I think that's pretty good. If we think of it in the previous frame of reference, there needs to be a beginning and end of the war, and we needed to win and see them go across that bridge. Not realistic. But if we say, wow, for a long time, we kept ourselves safe from that threat in the world, and then I realized there are other threats in the world, that's pretty good. And I totally take your point on the loss of life, both U.S. military and the Afghan civilians themselves. But in the bigger context, I think maybe that was a good use of our force. And I just think we have to think about this differently. Does anybody in this room know how many U.S. military in Germany right now? 30,000? I'd say 35. 35,000. A ton of money every single year. Korea, Japan, you name it. And I realize they're not getting shot at, they're not getting killed on a regular basis and stuff. But still, I just think we need, the only thing that is surprising is that we continue to be surprised. And I think people need to be able, and people, I mean public officials, those who are making these decisions, need to have more honest conversations with the American people and continue to say, which we failed at 20 years ago, we continue to fail and say, the world's changed. Really different threats. And I was talking to you guys earlier, read this book by Nicole Perlroth called They Tell Me This Is How the World Ends. What's going on in cyberspace? I don't think we're prepared for that. do not think we're prepared for that. 20 years ago, hijackers had to figure out how to get on a plane, how to take over the cockpits, fly the planes into the sides of buildings. Now there are people sitting around the world with the means and the technology from wherever they are around the world to put a bug in software in a commercial airliner and bring it down. So I don't think we're thinking outside our usual frame of reference, and that scares me to death. So I wish I could say we're doing better or we're prepared and all these things. I don't think we are. I don't think we're much in terms of the mindset, in terms of how our leaders are leading us. I don't think we're any better off than we were 20 years ago.
And then my last question before I promise.
On that happy
I'll open
note.
it. Yeah, very happy. Well, let's talk about something happier.
Yeah.
Joe's touched on it already. The concept of moral injury. And if you've been reading Providence for a while, you know that moral injury, at least as I generally define it in the work that I do, is doing or allowing to be done something that goes against deeply held moral conviction. The U.S. military, the logisticians in the U.S. military have long mastered overcoming some of the challenges that have always faced fighting men. We've generally licked the problems of hunger and cold and heat that have been the primary disease, the primary killers of warfighters from time immemorial. But as the Vietnam combat veteran Carl Marlantes has said, we're only now learning that in addition to Kevlar, Kevlar vests, we need something like Kevlar for the soul, or as he says, a combat prophylactic for the soul, right? So I know you both have done, you and I are going to edit a book on moral injury. You do PTSD and
Equine therapy for military vets and first responders, PTSD.
Right. So what are, just briefly, what are the needs that are there? I asked numerous chaplains, is your home church a place where warfighters can redeploy home to and find the kind of spiritual care that they require? And do a person just, no, of course not. Less than, 0.5% of Americans are in uniform. Some ghastly low number of Americans actually have ever spoken to somebody in uniform. We've professionalized our military to the good of the nation, but we've also created a gap, right, where we've created a professional military class, and the rest of us don't have to have skin in the game if we don't want it. What do we need to do better as American people to care for our warfighters? Last thoughts on that.
I don't have any solutions to the problem, but I think there are a couple ways to think about it. I think one is, I think there can be something isolating about having had these experiences that cause trauma, right? So maybe you witnessed something, or maybe you committed an act that you have a hard time, circling with your moral beliefs or your faith. The few examples that I have somewhat close knowledge of, sometimes there's an analytical component, right? Where really what it takes is being able to walk through the moral justification for war. If you don't understand why there can be morally justified violence, then when you commit violence against another human person, you might have a hard time reconciling that with your moral beliefs. So sometimes there's an analytical component. Other times it's kind of deeper than that, and analysis isn't enough. And so I haven't personally had this, but a friend of mine was a squadron commander and had an airman come to him, and one of the things he said was, I don't understand how God could love me after what I've done. And what he had done was completely by accident. He did everything by the book. He did everything the way he was supposed to have done. And at the last minute, a civilian entered the field of view. And it wasn't negligence, right? You understand what I'm saying? This was kind of textbook mistakes happen, But he was now having this existential crisis over it, asking really deep theological questions as a result, right? So sometimes I think there's an analytical component. Other times I think there's a connection that could be really valuable between service members and our fellow citizens. I think that has become difficult. I think the primary driver of that is the all-volunteer force, right? So I'm a third-generation airman. That's not uncommon. So I have my people, and my people understand what it's like to be in the military, and then maybe your people don't. And if we don't connect those two things together, then it's harder for service members to kind of integrate back into society after their traumatic experiences. And so I think storytelling is an important part of that. Lots of the war memoirs really all the wars we've had in the last 70 or 80 years, lots of the war memoirs suggest that there's this moment where the person tried to open up to a friend who had no military experience, and the friend gave them the impression that, whoa, that's too heavy for me. I can't hear that, right? Well, if that's the impression, then people are going to be incentivized to bottle all that up. That can't be it. right? We, the United States of America, we citizens have to share the burdens of war, and one of the ways of doing that is to do this kind of work of mending, right, of reconnecting service members with society after the fact. And I don't necessarily mean after the war or after the conflict, but even after the deployment, right?
Yeah.
When someone redeploys home, there's work that has to be done there. So storytelling can be a big part of that, and I think sometimes listening is a big part of that too. So I know that's not a cure-all. I don't think that's a solution, but I think it's a couple ways that we can start.
But that's hopeful because Americans are really good at listening to each other.
Like I said, I promise I won't get political, but I think we are good at listening to each other in this context, right? When we're sitting across the table from one another, we're actually really good at it. There are other venues where we're much less good. That's good.
Yeah. Okay, on a very big macro level, I think if we have required public service in a couple of years, it doesn't have to be in the military, but public service, that would make some incremental gains to make people go, oh, well, we are all part of this. And my experience, which is very anecdotal the last year or so, is we don't do enough good job when you're in uniform and you're doing these things, giving you the counseling and support you need. And it's understandable. There's a lot going on, fast, boom, 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 right? But what happens is when they do come out, like your friend gets out, the visual is dropping off a cliff, and they try to share it with some friends, and the friends who weren't no clue, and it's that drop off. And I think the military's got to think about this in terms of, well, we recruited them, we retained them for X years, they're still ours, and they need to provide greater support. I cannot tell you the number of veterans I've met in the last year and a half, who have just completely given up on the VA. So whether it's equine therapy or another form of therapy that they absolutely need, they've given up on the VA because it's so hard to get funding. Equine therapy is still pretty relatively new. They kill themselves trying to get that paid for, so then they just try to figure out some other way to get it paid for. That should not be. They should, once they serve us, whatever they want to try, if they think it's going to help them, we should be able to make that happen. So I've sworn I will never go back into government again, but every once in a while I think I should go to the VA and blow that place up. Because it's insane. Right? That's insane. But I just don't know how much we can help when they're actually in uniform doing these things, but we certainly should do a better job when they get out.
Questions, comments,
Insults.
How many stories? Jeff.
One question in regards to when you're in that crisis situation of what happened in the economic attack, how do you process your information to determine what information is true and what's false? I remember that day I was in the Raber building on Capitol Hill. And there was a
crazy
rumor
up
going
there.
around that there was a car bomb that had gone across the street in the State Department of Volume 1, which obviously turned out to be untrue. How do you make those determinations of what is true or false?
You spend one day with the military and you know that one of the best, most accurate statements is first reports are always wrong. And I'm so blessed for whom I worked and the people who worked with me. I had this spectacular senior military assistant named George Weingatz, former Army helicopter pilot. And a few months before 9/11, we were trudging along the transformation line. But you work in a place like that and you're supposed to have crisis management plans, right? So Rumsfeld tapped some recently retired admiral, whatever, to build the state-of-the-art crisis management plan, and he's working on it for weeks. And we get called in on Sunday afternoon to get the briefing on the big crisis management plan. Then I go to it and I come back with 3 or 4 binders filled with pages, wire diagram charts, and I came back to my office and Ryan was there and he goes, well, how was it? I said, we're all gonna die. It was the most complicated thing you've ever seen in your life. Nobody could execute it. And I turned to this guy, Ryan Dance, and I said, my department was 200 people in the building, another 700 or 800 around the world. And I said, you've got to give us a crisis management plan. And we didn't know what it would be, but you knew you faced something. And the essence of it was 2 things. One was understand your role and responsibility in case of a crisis, and being able to communicate with one another. And so, for instance, my role was going to be, in case of a crisis, sticking close to Rumsfeld and deciding with him and with the White House, CIA, state, what are we going to say, when are we going to say it? And we were so religious about less information that we felt good about rather than more information that we didn't feel good about. But we would start every briefing, every conversation, this is what we know now. We might find out parts of us are wrong, we will correct it, which we did. So we were adamant about that. But a funny little thing, even back then, we didn't have smartphones and stuff like that, but we were pretty addicted to cell phones and pagers and things like that. and everybody had all the contacts on desktops and things like that, and Ryan Dan said, this is nuts, this was way before 9/11, so we're too dependent on that. So everybody on my staff, you had hard copies of all the key contact numbers. Everybody, you know, president on down, everyone in our department, everybody around the world, and office numbers, cell numbers, home numbers, pagers, etc., and on pieces of paper. And he made us keep them with us at all times, in our cars and in our homes. And the day of, I don't know where you all were, but a lot of services weren't working. A lot of cell phones weren't working. And we could communicate with everybody. So it was a very simple thing, but it was spectacularly important. But you know, the bigger strategic thing was we're going to put out what information we know and not more. So, for instance, out of New York, people were they were going on air saying tens of thousands of people died in the World Trade Towers. And we got asked every minute from when the plane first hit the Pentagon how many people have died, and we would not give numbers. Somebody from Arlington County speculated some wild number, and I had to call them up and say, we don't know. So we were very careful, but tried to be as forward-leaning as possible.
You all sort of ended your remarks just now. We were talking about how the American public doesn't know your experiences. All volunteer, there are lots of culprits for that. If you all would talk a little bit about the last 20 years, how the American people process information about our wars, how your now successors in the Pentagon talk about war, and when we fight our next war, and it's here and it's coming again somewhere, how do we talk about the next war in a way that brings along the American people? That's not the right way I'm saying, or certainly not sell the war but be transparent, communicate. How are we listening, the American public, listening about war, and how do we communicate it better along to bring sort of, when we need to have our citizens be brought to a national purpose, we can do that.
I'll give it a shot. So I'll just speak from my sort of purview. You know, because the predator world was so focused on high value targeting, and because we weren't, I mean, in a sense, it would be safer to be on Kandahar airfield with 20,000 NATO forces, right? But if you're driving up the road every day to work, right, like if they got roadside bombs in Afghanistan, there's no reason they couldn't create a roadside bomb in southern Nevada, right? So, and so our culture was one that you never talk to anyone about anything ever. And so we built, and it was you know, for force protection reasons. And so I think we let that culture live way beyond its usefulness. And so we didn't have a posture that said, let's engage with the American people by whatever means, right? By inviting, and there were some bad experiences too, where I think some bad faith actors got access to crews and then told the story in a way that really wasn't faithful to the facts. And that encouraged commanders to just lock everything down. And I think that was really not great. I think that was for the worst. And so now, who gets to tell the story of what Predator and Reaper operations are like? Well, Good Kill does, and Eye in the Sky does, right? And I think that's, I can't speak for special operations.